Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. After 102 days COVID-free, New Zealand once again has identified cases of community transmission. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
Auckland is in a level 3 lockdown. The dissolution of Parliament in preparation for general elections has been put on hold. Otago graduations have been postponed. There are queues again at the supermarkets. Should we seal our borders until there's a vaccine? I'm hoping that you'll help us examine that from a few different angles.
Right.
Firstly, can we do that to other New Zealanders who haven't come home yet? Can we say, you've had enough time, sorry, too late, until we get a vaccine?
It's an interesting question, but it's based on the assumption that sealing our borders would solve our problems, and I don't think that's true. Let's put this in context, Bruce. We already have one of the most stringent closed border regimes in the world. To give you an idea what I mean, is that we used to, before COVID, receive 20,000 international visitors a day, and that's now down to 400. So basically, air and sea travel is off limits to virtually everyone, except what they call people who hold New Zealand passports or have permanent residence here. And there are some exceptions, those being people that the country needs to keep things going, essential maintenance specialists that we do not have here, for example. But these exceptions are pretty few and far between. So I think we already have a very tough border regime.
From an economic and a practical point of view, is there any compelling reason not to close the border?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons not to go much further down that route. First of all, just having the present level of closed borders has dealt a major economic hit to our economy, both in the area of tourism and also in education services. Because people are not being allowed in, this is having a huge effect. Tourism was one of our biggest earners in terms of income for this country. And we shouldn't underestimate the downstream effects. I mean, we often think of COVID-19 as being a purely medical crisis, whereas in fact it's an economic one as well. The world's economy is first facing the worst recession since the late 20s, when the Wall Street crash occurred and generated what was called the Great Depression. And right across the board, there is economic negative indicators, whether in manufacturing, unemployment, levels of employment. And we're not alone in this, because we didn't go down into a lockdown strategy on our own. Much of the world did that. And this is having a huge impact on the global economy, unfortunately a negative impact. We could compound that if we actually sealed our borders. Why? Well, New Zealand depends on its living. It exports more than 30% of what it produces internally, mainly agricultural products. And we have managed to keep that going, although our exporters are facing huge extra costs now because of the rising costs of air freight and things like that, because of the lack of demand. So yeah, there's lots of additional costs, but to shut down the prospects of being able to trade altogether, I think would be extremely negative.
So is there any point talking about then, if it wasn't just New Zealand doing this, if every country did this, what would the implications be of all the countries having a hard border?
Well, I mean, as I say, I think at the moment many countries have been exercising closed borders, not sealed borders. And that's already had pretty dramatic impacts on the economy. And it's a very tough situation we face. I mean, there have been commentators and experts in this country, such as Sir Peter Gluckman, Rob Fyfe, former head of Air New Zealand, and Helen Clark. They've argued that it's inevitable we must open up. But I think against that argument, we can see the example of Melbourne in the last 2 months, which has seen a 6-week lockdown imposed, which affects 5 million people after an explosion of COVID-19 cases. I think on balance, putting safety first is the key. That is to say, I don't buy the argument that we should open up You know, what we have to be, while New Zealand has been in a relatively good position internationally, we've had, for over 100 days, we had no internal transmission, at least that was measurable. We now have it again, unfortunately, in the Auckland area, and the government is moving hard and early again, as it says, to try to stamp it out. I think on balance that's a sensible approach. I think it's important that we try to minimise the spread of COVID-19, because what we have seen in places like the United States, where COVID-19 has cost more than 160,000 lives, nearly 170,000, the economic effects are even more devastating. And actually, opening up to a world which is exploding with COVID-19. As I speak to you, more than 20 million cases of COVID-19 and more than 700,000 people have died from it. So, you know, we are, how should I put it, we've got to be very careful here. And I think keeping a very carefully regulated border regime is sensible. We'd like to loosen that to stimulate the economy, but if we do it prematurely, we run the risk of importing quite substantial COVID-19 infections, which again would stall our economy. So it's a question of getting a balance.
And you feel we've got that balance right at the moment?
I think so. We've been able to, I mean, it's been commented widely in New Zealand, although tourism has been really badly hit, and has the educational sector, some other sectors of the economy have remarked how quickly things have picked up. We've been able to, under this closed border regime, we've been able to go down to level 1 and exercise a fair amount of freedom. People have been able to resume their business and almost life as normal, but not quite. But it's because we are hostage to our external environment, where COVID-19 is rampaging, that we've got to be very, very careful. And it is getting, you know, politics is all about tough choices between the intolerable and the disagreeable. There's no painless option here. We're going to take a major economic hit by maintaining a very tough border regime. But the alternative, in my view, is worse.
What can we do then to try and open up the borders?
Well, yes. I mean, as we said earlier, Bruce, COVID-19 is both a medical problem and it's an economic problem. And ideally, we would like to open up our economy and trade with those countries that have actually also managed the problem well. So I think the most sensible strategy is not to seal our borders, but to maintain our system at the moment of closed borders, with with exceptions for returning Kiwis, but look to open and build air bridges with those countries. Might be South Korea, it might be Singapore, might be Vietnam. Vietnam's had virtually no cases of COVID-19, where both sides have confidence that the other is managing the problem well, and the health protocols could be put in place. So I think that's probably what we're going to see. In the absence of a vaccine, we will still see countries which have been rigorous in dealing with the problem look to cooperate amongst themselves and gradually build up an air bridge between them and therefore resume full trading.
So what about a vaccine?
Yes, I mean, I suppose it could be argued if you sealed the borders until there was a vaccine, that might work. But the problem is we don't know when there will be a vaccine. Yes, Russia has just declared that it's got a vaccine, but it hasn't gone through the sort of rigorous tests that most developed countries in the liberal democratic world would subject it to. So there's enormous scepticism from the World Health Organization about the Russian vaccine and whether people should be given this vaccine without the rigorous system of prior testing. So yeah, I mean, on the question of the vaccine, there's a big question mark. We just don't know when there'll be a vaccine. And you could seal your borders and not get a vaccine for 2 or 3 years, in which case you would just be literally undermining in the most rigorous possible fashion the national and the global economy.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.